Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital in products and manufacturing. In this episode, the podcast team is joined by Jeff Gleeson, an aerospace manufacturing professional who spent 33 years at Lockheed Martin on the manufacturing side before retiring and founding his own consulting firm called DMEAC. In this conversation, Jeff shares his firsthand in-the-trenches experiences when it came to digital transformation as it was tried and applied at Lockheed. He notes that one of the biggest hurdles he saw when moving to a model-based approach in manufacturing was both politics and culture. Let's listen in and hear some of his take on some of the reasons why people and culture are often the most challenging when embracing organizational change.
Welcome back to Stay Sharp, the podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. I am Jen Furlow, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hi, everybody.
And today we're talking through some of the challenges of establishing a model-based enterprise. There's a lot of talk in the industry, a lot of discussion lately about the value of going model-based. So we're going to kind of dig into why more companies aren't doing it. What are some of the challenges they're facing? Joining Jonathan and I today is Jeff Gleeson. In fact, Jonathan and Jeff were part of a 4-person discussion panel at iBaseT's Accelerate conference recently that served as the inspiration for today's podcast. Jeff brings a wealth of real-world experience, over 30 years at Lockheed Martin. Jeff, can you share a bit about yourself and your experience with our listeners?
Certainly. Thank you, Jen. So presently, I'm an independent consultant. I'm president, founder, chief cook, and bottle washer at DMEAC LLC. That's DMEAC, which stands for Digital Manufacturing Enterprise Architecture Consulting. Just rolls right off the tongue. Just call it DMEAC.
I'm glad you explained it, though, Jeff. The spelling, it's important. That's good.
So I presently work with both technology service providers and manufacturers to help them achieve the goal of digitalizing their operations. But as you noted, Jen, I just retired last summer, after over 32, almost 33 years at Lockheed Martin Aeronautics Company. And in my career there, I spent my entire career in production operations. Okay, so I'm not an engineering guy who I think, probably, I'm guessing a lot of your guests, if you're talking about, model-based enterprise digital transformation, a lot of them probably come from the engineering side of the house, which is appropriate.
You are exactly right.
Yeah. Or they may come from the IT organization. Okay. I am neither. My whole career was in production operations. And in that time, I would alternate back and forth from being a practitioner of our production business processes and an innovator of those same processes. So I would bring my experience in the trenches, trying to use our processes to the task of improving them. And, the business processes I was a practitioner of ranged from tool design and tool manufacturing, NC programming. I was an NC programmer, process planning to include, EBOM to MBOM transformation, the production of the routings for the shop floor, the detailed manufacturing work instructions that the operators use. I was responsible for all of that. I also had responsibility on the major assembly line, on the F-16 program. All the people that put together the aft fuselage, the forward fuselage, the wings, I was over all of that for a time. And also over execution of engineering change implementation. Then on the innovation side, on a couple different occasions, I worked on Lockheed Martin's virtual product development initiative over all of the manufacturing tools. So our initial use of manufacturing simulation tools, like the old DNEB that became DLMEA, part of Dassault. Our initial implementation of those, also our initial implementation of light 3D visualization, what eventually became, the JT format. I was responsible for our implementation of that. Our first electronic manufacturing execution system, my group was responsible for that, getting us off of paper. And then 20 years later, again, in a different role, I was responsible again for replacing our first MES with our next generation MES. and also the application of PLM tools, again, for more advanced manufacturing simulation and other forms of simulation like discrete event simulation and implementation of the industrial Internet of Things and so forth. So, in my 32 plus years, I went back and forth between using those business processes in the trenches and then trying to improve on those processes through digital transformation.
Thanks, Jeff. So when I said that you brought a wealth of real world experience, I was not kidding. That is a lot. As we're getting started today on some of the challenges of creating a model-based enterprise, Jonathan, a lot of times we start by defining what we mean, as far as what we're talking about. Can you kind of lead us off with defining what we're talking about when we're talking about a model-based enterprise?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just the fact that we've brought Jeff to the conversation and Jeff brings the experience that he brings really points to that, right? What we're talking about with MBE. So from my perspective, model-based enterprise is about an organization that is using models across domains in their company, right? So across engineering, manufacturing, service, sales, any of those areas of their business, they're using models. And by models, I don't mean 3D geometry, 3D models, right? But any kind of sort of data-rich description of the product, of the process, of whatever it is they're using to operate as an organization, that they're using those models and they're sharing them, right? So it's getting rid of the siloed, over-the-wall type of communication, sort of as a counterpoint to drawings, right? Where drawings were, I define it over here in engineering, and then I give it to someone in manufacturing to then interpret, rather than sharing a model that just conveys that information. They can consume it and use it and add to it in the same way that I can, sort of across those boundaries. So for me, MBE is about using models of all forms to get everybody on the same page and share that information across the organization. So I think that's, to me, that's level setting the MBE topic that we're talking about. And I want to dive right in, Jeff, because you've got so much experience dealing with an organization trying to get there, working on those things. To me, the headline, big issue, there's lots of technical stuff we can dig into too, but the big one is OCM. How does an organization go from one way of behaving into this model-based, model-sharing world where you're working on things together and everybody's got to sort of work together and play in the same sandbox? What do you see there? What did you experience?
Well, I think you kind of hit on it in your definition there of the model-based enterprise. It requires a change in mindset, I think, and specifically what you hit on was your definition of model, which is to say, first of all, in model-based definition and the model-based enterprise, your organization needs to have an expansive idea of what the model is. Okay, what it is not is simply your 3D CAD solid that defines the shape of the product. That is absolutely part of the model, but that's we've been doing that for 30 years or more, right? And didn't consider it to be a model-based definition. So what do you have to add to the 3D CAD solid to have a model-based definition? Well, the answer is, to a large extent, the answer is metadata, right? It's all the additional data that may be invisible to the user, but it's baked in either in the CAD model or, again, going back to this expansive idea of the model, a lot of those attributes could be in the PDM, right? Outside of, but logically related to the CAD model. And so all of your producers of model-based work products and all of your consumers of model-based work products, which extends, by the way, beyond just model-based definition. There's all model-based work instructions and model-based everything anymore, right?
Right. I mean, to that point, like CNC is, in a lot of ways, it's model-based machine instructions, right? I mean, you're coming from a model to generate digital instructions for a machine to do certain things, right? So there's all kinds of things that really, when we dig into and we think about them, there's more model to it than maybe we thought.
So, as you're going about your job, part of this cultural change or change in mindset needs to be that all of your producers of these work products, as well as your consumers of these work products, need to think beyond, I'm going to say, the drawing, although in a model-based enterprise, there theoretically are no drawings, right? But
theoretically.
Yeah, but in terms of continuity, whereas we can't think so simply as, okay, so yesterday I did things with a paper 2D drawing, and it was all right there in the drawing, and so now we're going model-based. So I'm going to just transfer that whole way of thinking about things now to a model, and it's all going to be right there in the 3D CAD solid, right? So I'm just going to look at it on the screen. I, as a human operator, in whatever capacity, now I'm just going to pick that stuff up off the screen in a 3D while viewing a 3D model instead of picking it off of a 2D drawing. Well, that really misses the point to a large extent. Okay, this isn't just a change in formats. This is a very different way of doing business, to where you really want the let's talk about it in terms of a SIPOC. You may have heard of the term SIPOC. Maybe many of your viewers have too. So it's an acronym, SIPOC, which stands for suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and consumers or customers. As you approach the model-based enterprise, I think it's critical that you, in the middle of SIPOC, your inputs, your process, and your outputs all need to be digital to the extent possible. And that should be possible these days to a very large extent. Okay, so if you're, as I said, I came from production operations. So I've always been a consumer of product definition data. Right? Now, it has traditionally come in the form of, to state the obvious, traditional formats like a 2D drawing or a applications list and a parts list and, process specification documents. Well, that stuff, even after the point when it had been digitized, that is to say, we put paper on glass, same basic business processes, but it was all on a computer screen now, but all the same steps, same workflows, just electronic instead of through office mail or something like that. The process hadn't really changed all that much, just the form factor. Well, in digital transformation or in the model-based enterprise, that has got to fundamentally change, so that I don't know that I would say you remove steps, but you certainly remove steps that have to be done by human operators. You automate them to the maximum extent possible, right? So, and you can do that if in that SIPOC, if your inputs into a given process have been properly digitized and made semantic and machine readable. And by the way, when we say machine readable in this context, I find that some people think, going back to the NC programming, so the CNC machining center is just going to directly read in the model-based definition and program. No, that's not that kind of machine. When we say machine readable, simply a computer, your engineering workstation is the machine we're talking about here. So sometimes instead of machine readable, I like to say computer interpretable, because the machine in machine readable is really, in this case, a computer. So you got to make those inputs machine readable. And then the process may be largely the same as it was when it was done manually. But if you've got a process where you expected your human operators, whether they were a quality engineer, a manufacturing engineer, a process planner, whatever that operator was that was performing that process, if they followed rules to do that process, which is pretty typical, and you wanted them to stick to the rules, well, hopefully those rules should be reducible to a computer algorithm, okay? So instead of a process planner following his planning manual on the shelf, you've just got an algorithm that is taking a computer, a machine-readable input, putting it through an algorithm and producing another machine-readable output, which implies that you have to be very conscious of what the next step in the process is. And is it a process that can also be performed by an algorithm? And if so, what kind of inputs does that next downstream computerized process need so that I can be sure that my output becomes machine readable input for the next step in the process? And everybody's got to think that way. It's not just a matter of changing the form factor. Oh, I'm not going to read drawings on a layout table anymore. I'm going to view a 3D model on a screen. The implications are much, much greater than that.
Yeah, to your point, Jeff, I think when you talk about that SIPOC model, you have to think about the S and the C not necessarily being people, but sometimes they are the machines, like you mentioned. Not necessarily a shop floor machine, but a computer, a software program, an algorithm. So it may be that when engineering's doing its model-based definition, that output is going to a program or an algorithm to read that in, which is where that semantically rich information comes in, et cetera, et cetera, right? But to your point, that's a big cultural shock for a lot of organizations.
I like that point, Jonathan, that it's basically the S and C are basically suppliers and consumers of data, not necessarily the products themselves or the models themselves. So how hard is it, Jeff, for folks to make that transition, to think that differently? I think you had talked about, earlier when we were talking, you talked about relating it to kind of an agile approach.
Yeah. Turns out that for reasons that are hard to explain, it turns out to be pretty difficult, apparently, for humans to kind of, step outside of their traditional silo and really collaborate deeply and with great effect with folks either upstream or downstream of them. It is obviously doable, but we all tend to, each of us, to state the obvious, knows our own job best. We know our own role best. We're comfortable there. We feel like we're successful there. And so that's where we want to focus. But you've got to step back and look at the bigger picture and talk to the folks upstream of you and downstream of you to make sure that, either they understand what you need as inputs, or that you understand what the next guy downstream needs as inputs. I don't know. Like I say, I don't know why that turns out to be so hard, but it just is. I think it's a matter of inertia. We're in our comfort zone. We work day in and day out with people in our same organization as opposed to lateral organizations. And that inertia just seems to carry us forward, but it inhibits the kind of collaboration that's really needed to do what we've talked about here.
I want to ask about that one, Jeff, because I've seen something similar when we talk about model-based kinds of activities, mostly in the engineering domain. And I'm curious if some of this rolls over to the production side. I think that inertia, I've seen that one. I agree with you, right? People are, this is how I've worked. This is how I should work. This is how we work, that kind of thing.
Not to mention, these are engineers, right?
Right.
So ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right. But I think there's another one that I see in organizations, and I'm curious if you see this too, is the fear element, right? We're changing things, so I'm always a little uncomfortable with change, but then what we're really doing, we're trying to automate and optimize some of this, may mean that we're shifting around who does the work and when they do it and how much work they do, right? So there's a little bit of replacing my job role or part of my job role with software, or the machine can do that step for me. Well, wait, what am I going to do? that kind of thing. Do you see some of that on the organizational cultural challenges too?
Yeah, I've seen a bit of all of it. I've seen, obviously everyone's different. I think everyone generally is well intentioned, right? And they want to do a good job. They want to do the right thing. They want to be a team player. It's just that what they view as being contributory to those goals varies from person to person, right? And I've had engineers, years ago when we were first talking about model-based definition on the F-35 program at Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. I got pushback from engineers that said that we were just trying to create more work for the engineers, by creating views in the model, or view states or whatever you want to call them in the model-based definition. I'm thinking, how is that any more work than you do today? I mean, you do it today,
right?
It's just different work.
Yeah, but because I was making the point to them that if they're going to put all the PMI in the model, what we did not want on the again, as the receiver of their work product, of the product definition data, we didn't just want a component floating in 3D space that looked like a pincushion with a million leader lines coming off of it with PMI in 3D space. That's great, but that's not very usable. And if the message is, okay, here it is, there's a model-based definition, all the PMI, it's all in there. You just got to find it. Make sure you get everything. Don't miss anything.
Here's your haystack.
Yeah, exactly. So, one thing that traditional 2D drawings did for you pretty well after, many years of refinement is they laid out a story for you, right? Sheet one's typically your plan view with a, overall view of it. And it was, your starting point from which you would take off different orthogonal projections or section views or detail views, and it would tell you what sheet to go in, what zone, what's drawing zone to go find that. And you knew that if I wanted to know the specifics, like some dimensions or specs related to this area of the component, I follow the drawing views and I'll find the relevant PMI. My point was, you still need to somehow lead us through the PMI. And I think now one way we'll be able to do that better in a model-based future is through the automatic generation of bills of characteristics, the BOC, which I think, so if you're now, traditionally where, folks like maybe in quality would balloon a drawing, so they put a little balloon by a bit of like a note or a dimension or a requirement to say, okay, well, that's, we're going to have to account for that somewhere in our inspection plan. We're going to have to account for this and account for that, so they'll go through and balloon the drawing. In a very mature model-based enterprise in the future, the bill of characteristics will be automatically produced, and it won't be a different bill of characteristics for every producer that consumes that drawing, as it is today with a traditional 2D drawing, right? So if you, and I'm going to go down a slight rabbit hole here, but today, if you have the same component that is produced maybe in-house and at a supplier or 2 or 3 different suppliers, and if you ask, well, why would you do that? Well, just look at the supply chain problems we've had in the past. We're going back to having multiple sources for a lot of critical components. So that's why you would do that. Well, today, every one of those producers, including maybe your own shop, is going to balloon the drawing for themselves and come up with their own bill of characteristics, their own list of inspection points. Well, wouldn't it be much better if that is done once up front by the design authority? And so every producer gets the same bill of characteristics. So they're all they're all inspecting it the same way, or at least getting inspecting the same things. They may approach it different ways based on their capabilities in their shop, but they're inspecting the same things to the same standards, and so it's consistent. That's something that you don't have today.
That's another cultural thing there, Jeff, right? I've seen that as we talk about process changes in organizations. That can be tough for people, right? If you do make people standardize and do it a standard way, it's a little bit tough. A lot of people take a lot of pride in their individuality. I do it this way. This is the technique I bring to the table, that kind of thing. And some of this has that challenge too, I think, where people can say, I see why we're standardizing, but I don't like it. I thought I added that value, that kind of thing.
Right. And, I think, like I said, I wouldn't impugn most people's motives. I think everybody wants to do a good job. They all just have a different view of what doing a good job looks like. And there may be...
That's right. Or an understanding of what the objective is, right? I mean, they're doing their best, but this is something I think is really important on projects where you're doing this, is helping everybody understand what the shared goal is, right? Because to your point, if everybody's working with best interests at heart, but they understand the goal to be different, you're going to get different results.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I think that strong visionary leadership at the top is critical. And then constant communication, a lot of repetition, laying out the vision for the whole organization so that, everybody shares in that common vision and understands what their place in it is. I think if you can do that, then all those well-meaning people who really want to do a good job have a more harmonized view of what a good job looks like,
Right.
Well, and I think the other, to Jonathan, what you had said earlier about there being a fear-based component to the inertia. I also feel like the more constantly you communicate, this is why we're making the change. This is the value to the organization. It's not denigrating your value in any way. We're just trying to move forward, and you'll move forward with us. Any kind of communication you can do to take out that fear is going to reduce the resistance to any sort of change. We've talked about, Jeff, a number of times how people, process, and technology, people is the hardest part of that. And it's the part that we talk about the least because it's the hardest part. We're much more comfortable in the technology space.
Oh, the technology is always the easy part. As complicated and as difficult as it is, comparatively speaking, it's always the easy part.
I'm going to use that point, Jeff, what you say there, to pivot to ask you the big opinion question in my mind. So when you think about model-based enterprise and implementations of those concepts and what you've learned in the past and what you see now as a consultant and that kind of thing, what do you think the hardest part is? Obviously, it's not technology, right? As hard as it is, but if you had to sort of dive in and somebody said, look, help me understand the thing I really need to watch out for in a project like this, what would you tell them?
It might be the politics.
Okay.
The politics. But you've got to navigate your way through it, and there's going to be winners and losers. I think back to, I'm going to harken back to one of the time periods I described in, when I introduced myself and my bio at the opening. This was like in the late 90s, early 2000s when I worked on the Lockheed Martin's Virtual Product Development Initiative. Part of that, and it was a huge initiative, part of our effort to win the Joint Strike Fighter program, which we did win, and that became the F-35 program that we have today. Part of that large initiative was a kind of a CAD bake-off on the engineering side. Now, I was not... again, I was in production operations, so I was not involved in the CAD bake-off, which is one reason I picked it as an example that I could talk about with some distance, right?
Nice.
It wasn't my fault.
But it's a very good. You could easily extend this to my domain in production, right? but let's talk about someone else's domain. So, we've been users of a particular CAD system for many years already at that time. But, as one would do, and as you should do if you're undertaking innovation, is you throw open the doors wide and say, okay, look, we're going to consider other CAD systems now. We may end up staying with the same CAD system, or we may switch, but we owe it to ourselves to see what else is out there. We hadn't looked in a while. So you go out and you shop around. And, we had camps form around two particular different CAD solutions. One, which was, the next one.
I like to call them CAD religions, Jeff.
Yes, CAD religions. And, and this has to be done. You got to go through this process, but it should be rational, and it should be fact-based. You should engage in fact-based decision making. You should start with requirements. We're, at a defense contractor, of course, we're all about the systems engineering process, right? So we start with requirements. You need to start with requirements and go through all the steps to select the right solution for you. But not everybody's going to come to the same conclusion. Again, a lot of very intelligent, hardworking, well-meaning people are going to come to diametrically opposed conclusions. And, you'll almost invariably have at least two camps and maybe more, all of whom are absolutely convinced that their solution is the right one. And, in the trade space, for example, one common theme you're always going to run into is some people will think that an all-in-one solution is best, even if you have to compromise on functionality. At least theoretically, it's supposed to come with, baked-in integration between components of a larger system. And, on the other end of that argument are those that think a best-in-class kind of amalgamated solution is better, where you pick the very best application for this function and integrate it with the very best application for this other function and so forth. And that way, after you've integrated them, you've got the best possible solution. There are pros and cons.
That is absolutely a conversation we have all the time, Jeff. That exact point.
All the time. And I don't know that, I don't think you can say that in general, just generally speaking, that one of those viewpoints is right and the other one's wrong. I think that it's you've got to view that on a case-by-case basis. But in deciding that on a case-by-case basis, you end up going through a lot of very heartfelt arguments, between people with very strongly held positions. And that's that human factor. And, who's to say which of them is wrong and which of them is right? In some cases, it may be 6-1, half a dozen in the other. And it just all comes down to execution, where either way it could be. And the dimension I'm describing, which is to say, all in one versus best of class, that's just one dimension that people get wrapped up around, right? There are others as well, which just makes it all the more complicated. But it's a very good example.
But your point is that leads to, regardless of what those things are, those dimensions, it's going to lead to politics at some point that you've got to deal with.
Yes. And ultimately, if you're going to make progress, you got to choose a way. You got to make a decision, and you got to run with it. And then it comes down to execution. And in a lot of cases, you can be successful, whatever dimension you're in where you're choosing from multiple options. I think it's often the case that, more than one of them would work just great if you did a good job in implementing it. It comes down to execution. So that's why, it's very important to lay out that vision of the end state and get buy-in from everybody.
Well, and I think it gets back to the point of, even when you make the final decision, and this is how we're moving forward, again, communicating that, why we made that decision, getting a buy-in from the group that didn't win, so to speak, is important to the success of the execution. Because if that's not addressed, then your execution is going to limp along for potentially quite some time. So it's funny, like listening to you talk about this, I think Jonathan had said, what is like the hardest part of all of this? And you mentioned the word politics, and then we moved on a little bit. Jonathan mentioned the word religion. We talked about the passions that people have in their beliefs, and so clearly we're back to people are the hard part.
So I'll tell you,
Right?
I also own a small business on the side, and I've owned it for 18 years. Doesn't matter what kind of business it is. But I went to a trade show for that. It's utterly unrelated to aerospace or model-based definition or any of that stuff. Totally.
I know, it's a quick lube.
Yes, it is. It's a lube and tune. But I went to this was many years ago, probably 17 years ago. I went to a industry trade show for that, and I bumped into another guy whose family owned a whole chain of quick lubes, and he said, "I've never forgotten this because it just struck me as so true, and it kind of applies here as well, which is why I'm bringing it up." He said, "It's like my mama said, being a small business owner would be great if it wasn't for two things: customers and employees."
I love it.
Don't you have to have both employees? Yes, and that's the problem. They're people. They're people,
yes.
And the people make it difficult. It's well worth it, I will say. I love my business, but I would have to say the same thing there. What are the biggest challenges on my side business? Well, it's people. It's always people. People are always the hard part.
People are such a pain. Well, I want to, I know we had a long list of things we were going to talk about today, but I think we've spent, a significant, we've spent a lot of time on the most important part, which is the people. Mm-hmm. And I want to be cognizant of our listeners' time. But Jeff, if you're willing, I would love to have you back and dig into some of the technology challenges,
Sure.
The easy ones that are keeping people from moving to a model-based enterprise.
Sure.
And, if that would be, because it's like I said, it sounds like people are the problem. They're the solution.
They are.
But they're also the
both.
biggest problem. So
sure, I'd love to.
I want to thank you very much for joining us today, and Jonathan as well.
Absolutely.
And I want to remind our listeners, if there's something that you didn't hear today that you'd like to hear, brought up any questions, please reach out, communicate with us, be part of the conversation. It sounds like we'll be back for a second part of this, so be watching for that as well. And until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. If you have any questions about model-based strategies or some questions for Jeff Gleeson, please make a comment on our post or send us an email at podcast@razorleaf.com. We appreciate all the feedback we receive from our listeners, so don't be shy. Make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform or on our YouTube channel. Until next time, stay sharp.